You know, Revelations describes three series of judgments that come upon the earth during the tribulation period. The first series of judgments are known as the seven seals. The seven seals then lead to the seven trumpets, which then lead to the seven bowls of the wrath of God. Now, I'm using the word bowls, but if you notice up on our chart, I say vials. It can be used interchangeably because the Greek word can either mean a bowl or a vial, but basically it's just a dish that you can put things in. Now, we've already covered the seven seals, so tonight we're going to start studying the seven trumpets. So turn to the book of Revelation chapter 8, verse number 6. It says, "And the seven angels which had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound." Now, what we're going to find out is that each time a trumpet sounds, a different judgment comes upon the earth. But before we look at each judgment that comes upon the earth, let me point out a few things. First of all, some of the trumpet judgments resemble the plagues of Egypt. How many of you saw the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston? Believe it or not, that's based on a Bible story. It's in the book of Exodus. Charlton Heston played Moses. And when Pharaoh wouldn't let the children of Israel go, then God sent plagues. Well, some of the trumpet judgments resemble those plagues. Let me give you a few examples. The first trumpet judgment is a lot like the seventh Egyptian plague. The second trumpet judgment is like the first Egyptian plague. And the fourth trumpet judgment is very similar to the ninth Egyptian plague. In fact, I'm going to point out the similarities as we go through these different trumpet judgments. Another interesting similarity between the trumpet judgments and the Egyptian plagues has to do with their purpose. The Egyptian plagues had a threefold purpose. Number one, to prove the sovereign presence and power of God. God wanted everyone in Egypt to know that He and He alone was God. Number two, to show the powerlessness of the Egyptian gods to protect them. You know, they thought that their gods could protect them from Yahweh. God wanted to embarrass their gods. And number three, to show Pharaoh and all of Egypt that Pharaoh could not win. Pharaoh saw himself as a god. In fact, the Egyptians thought that the pharaohs were gods. And so they were under this impression that Pharaoh could protect them. And he wanted to show Pharaoh and all of Egypt that Pharaoh could not win. And the trumpet judgments have a very similar threefold purpose. Number one, to prove the sovereign presence and power of God. God's going to want everyone to know on this earth that He is God and He alone is God. Number two, He wants to show the powerlessness of science to protect mankind. You see, science has kind of become a god to us. We think that as long as science is progressing, it's going to get to the point that science can protect us. It can protect us from dying. It can protect us from getting old. It can protect us from anything that might be thrown at us. And God is going to show us that science is powerless to protect us. And number three, to show mankind that Satan and the Antichrist cannot win. God's kingdom is going to come. His will is going to be done on this earth as it is in heaven. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It will happen. So the purposes of the Egyptian plagues and the trumpet judgments are very, very similar. But there's another purpose for the trumpet judgments and bowl judgments that most people aren't aware of. In fact, all the commentaries that I have on the book of Revelation, only one mentions this purpose that I'm going to give you. So what is it? Well, I believe that one of the purposes of the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments is to cleanse the earth from the results of sin. You see, the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments are part of the redemption process. And let me explain what I mean by that. When Adam and Eve sinned, it didn't just affect them, it also affected the earth. If you remember, the ground was cursed as a result of Adam's sin. And all of creation was subjected to futility. In other words, it was subjected to death and decay. So part of the redemption process includes the earth, restoring it back to the way it was before the fall. Turn to the book of Romans chapter 8. I'm going to read verses 19 through 21 and prove it to you. This is a really interesting passage of Scripture. It says, "For all of creation is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will reveal who His children really are." Now, most of you think that day is the rapture, but it's not the rapture. Because when the rapture occurs, we're gone. So that doesn't reveal to the world who His children really are. They have an indication that we might be the children of God. But when will the world really know that we are? When we come back with Jesus Christ. For all of creation is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will reveal who his children really are. Against its will, all of creation was subjected to God's curse. But with eager hope, the creation looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay. Now, did you catch that? Did you catch what Paul wrote here? He says that one day the earth is going to be set free from the curse. But when is that going to happen? Well, the Bible tells us that the curse that was placed on the earth will be lifted before Christ reigns on this earth during the millennium. So the results of the curse, such as weeds, pests, ticks, flies, mosquitoes, sickness-producing germs, anything and everything that mars God's otherwise perfect creation. Can you think of anything that you don't like about this world? Seed ticks, chiggers, bed bugs, all of those things that mar God's otherwise perfect creation. Those things are going to be removed before Christ sets up his kingdom here on this earth. Nothing, and I mean nothing, is going to escape the fires of the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments. Those judgments will cleanse every portion of the earth, from the lowest depth to the highest point of the atmosphere. Every pest will be tracked down and killed. Every weed will be eradicated. What science has been trying to do with only limited success, the agents of God will do in 7 short years. So these judgments are a very necessary part of the redemption process, redeeming the earth, making sure that the earth is going to convert back or revert back to the way it was before the fall. So these judgments are going to purge the good and destroy the bad. And as I said, the earth is going to revert back to the way it was before Adam and Eve sinned. Now, I want you to keep all of this in mind as we begin to study these 7 trumpets and these bowls. Now, you might call them vials. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's the same. But I want you to keep this in mind because the earth is going to be affected in a mighty way as we see these judgments poured out upon the earth. But there is a purpose for it. And if you want to get technical, there are several purposes. There's the purposes, like we said, of the Egyptian plagues. God's going to come in and he's going to let everyone know that he is God. He's going to prove to everyone that science cannot protect you, right? And he's going to prove to everyone that Satan and the Antichrist cannot win. That's only some of the purposes. And then the other purpose is part of the redemption process, getting rid of all these things that were never meant to be a part of this earth. But the main thing we didn't even talk about, and what is that? That people will repent and be converted. So you need to keep all of these purposes in mind as we go through these trumpets and judgments. Don't just be looking at them thinking, thank God I'm not going to be here. All right? Understand that God has a purpose for every one of these judgments. He didn't just sit up there in heaven and think, boy, what would be good to do to them now? And sometimes we think like that. But no, there is a purpose for this. And when we begin to see 1/3 of the part of the earth affected here and 1/3 of the oceans affected here, there is a reason. And it's because these are all part of the redemption process. So that when Jesus Christ comes back, the earth is ready to be freed from the curse that was placed upon it when Adam sinned. Does that make sense? All right. So let's look at the first trumpet. Turn to Revelation chapter 8, verse number 7. The first angel sounded, and there followed hell and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. Now it's interesting, that word cast means they were hurled upon the earth. And the 3rd part of the trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. Now as I said earlier, the first trumpet is very similar to the 7th Egyptian plague, in which Moses raised his staff to the sky, and then hell and fire fell down upon the earth. Turn to Exodus chapter 9. Let's read verses 23 through 27. Let's look at this Egyptian plague. And Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire ran along the ground. Interesting. And the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. And the hail smote throughout all the land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast. And the hail smote every herb of the field, and brake every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, was there no hail. And Pharaoh sinned and called for Moses, and Aaron said unto him, I have sinned this time. The Lord is righteous, and I, my people, are wicked. Now, I want you to see something that doesn't go along with the judgments, but it does, in a sense. If you noticed, when these Egyptian plagues came upon the Egyptians, there was a dividing line. They affected the Egyptians, but they did not affect the Israelites. We need to keep that in mind, because before all of these judgments happened or started, what happened? The angel came in and he sealed 144,000. The children of God are sealed, and these things are not going to affect those that are left upon the earth. And I want you to see that. Now, what's kind of interesting as we see the hell and fire that's coming down is to look at both of these elements. Hell is ice. It's the opposite of fire. So if you have hell and fire happening simultaneously, then it's miraculous. It's supernatural. But the first trumpet judgment ups the ante. Instead of just hell and fire, blood is added. Blood is mingled with it. And the blood makes it even more supernatural. Now, there are those who are always looking for a natural cause to explain the supernatural. So you have those that say that the fire is really not lightning, which could naturally happen during a hailstorm, right? And the blood only alludes to the color red. So the blood isn't actually blood, but is red rain that occasionally falls in the Mediterranean area as a result of the red dust particles that comes from Sahara. But I don't buy that. And I'll tell you why I don't buy that. First of all, whenever lightning is mentioned in the New Testament, the Greek word astrape is used, and it means lightning. It never refers to fire. So if John had meant to say lightning, he would have used that word, but he didn't. He used the word pur, which means fire, not lightning. So this is hell and fire mixed or mingled with blood. And I can use the very same argument when it comes to the blood. The color red is the Greek word puros. And if John had meant to say that the hell was red or the color of red, he would have said so. He would have used the Greek word puros, but he didn't. He used the Greek word ahima, or haima, and haima means blood. So when the first trumpet is blown, hell and fire mingled with blood falls upon the earth. So I'm not looking for any normal cause to try and explain this supernatural event. But you know what's interesting? You always have those scholars that are trying to do that, especially in the book of Revelation. And whenever I have a person that comes up to me, and some of you might be thinking, I'm going to approach Pastor Allen after this, and I'm going to say, well, couldn't it be this? And you're trying to think of all these natural causes that could explain this supernatural phenomenon. And my question to you would be this. If the Egyptian plagues were literal, what makes you think that these won't be? And if God did these things in the past, what makes you think that He won't do them in the future? People, He will. These things literally happened. They're written as history. So if God did it in the past, He can surely and will surely do it in the future. In Job chapter 2, verse number 30, God said this, I will show wonders in heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire. So this is going to happen just as God said it will happen. Now, I want you to notice what happens when the earth is hit with this judgment. Look back at verse number 7. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down upon the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. I don't think we really think about the results. A third of the earth was scorched, burned up. A third of the trees were burned up. And all the green grass was burned up. Now, I want you to try and imagine what it means for a third of our forest to be burned up. Try to picture, if you would, a third of all the great forest in the world being wiped out. A third of the Amazon. A third of the Congo. A third of the Yosemite and Yellowstone parks. Think about those being burned down. Now, because this seems to only come to a third part, The idea is not that a third part of the Amazon rainforest, or a third part of the Congo, or a third part of the Yosemite, all of these places, a third of all of these is taken down. No. The indication or the implication is that it's going to be in one area. But it would be the equivalent of all the Amazon rainforest being scorched, burned down. It's a natural disaster beyond anything imaginable. And if you could, I want you to imagine all of the firefighters trying to stem this fire, thousands of times greater than anything we've ever seen before. That's what the Bible is picturing here when we come to the first trumpet judgment. Now let's look at what happens when the second trumpet judgment sounds. Turn to verse number 8 and 9 and let's read it. It says, "And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea. And the third part of the sea became blood, and the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed." Now, the second trumpet is very similar to the first Egyptian plague in which Moses struck the Nile with his staff and the water was turned to blood. Do you remember that in the movie, The Ten Commandments? You remember what he did? In fact, he actually, if I'm thinking right, I didn't go back and watch this. He didn't really do what it said to do. I think in the movie he just took his staff and he kind of put it over the water. But that's not what it says. Turn to Exodus chapter 7, verses 14 through 21. "Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn, and he still refuses to let the people go. So go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes down to the river. Stand on the bank of the Nile and meet him there. Be sure to take along the staff that turned into a snake. Then announce to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to tell you, let my people go so they can worship me in the wilderness. Until now you have refused to listen to him. So this is what the Lord says. I will show you that I am the Lord. Look, I will strike the water of the Nile with this staff in my hand." So he didn't spread it out over. He struck the Nile, and the river will turn to blood. The fish in it will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink any water from the Nile. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, take your staff and raise your hand over the waters of Egypt, all its rivers, canals, ponds, and all the reservoirs. Turn all the water to blood. Everywhere in Egypt the water will turn to blood, even the water stored in wooden bowls and stone pots." So Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. As Pharaoh and all his officials watched, Aaron raised his staff and struck the water of the Nile. Suddenly, the whole river turned to blood. The fish in the river died, and the water became so foul that the Egyptians couldn't drink it. There was blood everywhere throughout the land of Egypt. Now, let me talk a little bit about Egypt, if you don't mind. I'm going to make sure that I'm moving along because we're going to cover 4 of these trumpets tonight. But after we've gone to Israel a couple of times, I can't get any more people to go with me, then I'm going to take a tour back to Egypt. And we're going to go to South Egypt. Let me explain a little bit about Egypt. When Lisa and I and Shirley and my mom were flying into Egypt, it was kind of interesting because when we looked out, all we saw was sand. Sand. And then all of a sudden, there's green. And there's all these houses and things, and you can see the Nile River down there, and then you land. Now, what is interesting is, the word Egypt actually means black dirt. It did not, in their day, actually extend to what we think of Egypt today. You know, in Egypt today, we can go, we can draw all the boundaries and say, this is Egypt. But in the day of Jesus Christ, in the day of Abraham, the day of Moses, all Egypt was that green part by the Nile River. You could not exist in the sand out there because there was nothing to exist on. Now, what's kind of interesting is the Nile was actually worshipped because the Nile brought life. And so the Nile was thought of as their mother. And so what God is doing is He's striking at the very heart of their life, because without the Nile, they could not live in Egypt. Without the Nile, you wouldn't have the black dirt. Does that make sense? Now, what is interesting is there's quite a bit of difference between this plague and the second trumpet. Even though both of them turn the water into blood, the second trumpet is much more devastating than what happened in Egypt. And let me explain why. You see, the Egyptian plague only affected the nation of Egypt. But this is going to affect a third of the oceans. A third of the ocean will turn to blood. And a third of the sea creatures are going to die. And a third part of the world's ships will be destroyed. This is going to be a natural disaster like we've never seen before. Now, I want you to notice, I'm going to continue to say this each time the next trumpet sounds. Does that make sense? See, I just got through telling you when the first trumpet sounded that this is going to be something that we've never seen before. And bam, the Amazon rainforest, or maybe the Congo, or maybe all of Yellowstone and Yosemite Park, a third of all the forest, of all the trees is going to be burned up. And then we get to the second trumpet. And I tell you, this is going to be a natural disaster such as never been seen before. Now, why do I say that? Because it's progressively getting worse and worse and worse. Now, the cause of this natural disaster is a burning mountain that is cast into the sea. In fact, what's kind of interesting is if you read verses 8 and 9 very carefully, you'll notice that it's not a mountain. It says it's like a mountain. And this, of course, has sparked some debate among scholars, among theologians. Now, personally, I believe that this is a huge volcano that literally explodes. And its top, maybe in its base, goes flying into the ocean. In fact, when you look at what I put up here and you go look at others, I've got here a volcano on the second trumpet. Because I believe that's what it is. It's like a burning mountain that's just cast into the sea. But whatever it is, it's going to be extremely devastating. Now, so far, after two of the trumpet judgments, I want you to notice what the results are. A third of the earth's been scorched. A third of the forests have been burned down. All of the green grass has been burned up. A third of the oceans have turned to blood. A third of the sea creatures have died. And a third of the ships have been destroyed. Are we having fun yet? This is scary. Let's go a little bit further. Let's look at the third trumpet judgment. Turn to verses 10 and 11 in chapter 8. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. And it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. Now, I want you to underline the word star in verse number 10. Star is translated from the Greek word aster. Our English word asteroid comes from this Greek word. So this is basically an asteroid. Now, because of its size, it would probably be classified as a meteorite. How many of you know the difference between an asteroid and a meteorite? An asteroid is just bigger than a meteorite. If it's not big enough to be an asteroid, it's a meteorite. And I want you to understand that. Now, if it was an asteroid that hit Earth, we're talking about just completely wiping it out. Many of you have seen these movies, and I think Bruce Willis is in this one, and they have to take a spaceship and get to this asteroid, and they got to blow it up so it doesn't hit the Earth, right? Well, that was an asteroid, I think. I can't remember the movie exactly. But this is a meteorite. And when it enters our atmosphere, it catches on fire like all meteorites do. Now, I want you to notice how John describes it. There fell a great star, an asteroid, a meteorite from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. Now, how does a lamp burn? It burns at one end. It's not just a big ball of fire. In fact, what's interesting, all the other translations don't translate it as burning as a lamp. It's burning as a torch. And with a torch, you got fire on one end. So what this is showing us is you got this meteorite that as it falls through our atmosphere or enters our atmosphere, it catches on fire. And it looks like this comet with fire coming. And it doesn't hit any of the oceans. Instead, it hits land. Because when it hits, it pollutes a third of the earth's rivers and a third of the springs. Now, what's interesting is this meteorite has a name. This meteorite is called Wormwood. Look at verse number 11. And the name of the asteroid, the name of the meteorite is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. Now, the word wormwood is translated from the Greek word absinthos. Absinthus is actually a plant that belongs to the genus Artemisia. This plant is very bitter to the taste, and it produces a very dark green oil which can be used to kill intestinal worms. In fact, in John's day, if you had worms, the only way that you wormed yourself to get rid of them is you went and found this plant. And you would extract this dark green oil, and you would take it, and it would kill the intestinal worms. And that's why it's called wormwood. Now, the reason the meteorite is called wormwood is because it contaminates the water, and it makes it taste bitter. Now, here's what's interesting about wormwood. Though it won't poison you immediately, you can take it. It's not going to harm you in the immediate future. If you continue to drink it over a long period of time, it will cause death. That's why a large number of people will die. This meteorite is going to contaminate a third of the world's drinking water. Now, I want you to understand, this plant is not growing on the meteorite. All he's doing is giving them something they can understand, that when this meteorite hits, it's going to contaminate a third of the earth's drinking water. It's going to contaminate a third of the earth's rivers and a third of the earth's fountains or springs. That means drinking water. And so the water is going to taste bitter. And the reason it says it's called wormwood is because when you taste it, it doesn't immediately cause death. But if you continue to drink it, it will cause death. So all the people that are living in those areas are going to have one of two choices. They either don't drink the water and they die of thirst, which will happen very quickly because a man can only go about 3 days without water. Then he dehydrates, organs begin to shut down, and he dies. Or they can die very slowly from drinking the contaminated water. The choice is theirs. Now, you need to understand something. When all these things begin to happen, our first thought is, well, look what we do whenever there's a natural disaster. All the other countries, they're going to send this aid. People, it's not going to happen. Because when we start going through these first seals, we get to that nuclear war, it's going to cause a famine. You're going to see this great class warfare. Then all of a sudden there's going to be death. And then there's going to be a polar axis shift. And then we get to the first trumpet. When the first trumpet comes, there's hail, fire, and blood. And we see a third of all the forests are burned up. And all of a sudden people are getting overwhelmed. And then you got this volcano. And a third of the oceans are turned to blood. A third of the sea creatures begin to die. A third of the ships are wiped out. And I promise you at that time, every country is taking care of their own. And a third of the people who are located in this area, have one of two choices. You either drink the water to keep from dying and you die very slowly, or you don't drink the water and you die very quickly. But the choice is theirs. But the bottom line is this: a third of the earth's drinking water is going to be contaminated. Now, it's kind of interesting. We're starting to see this consistent pattern: a third, a third, a third, a third. Because if it wasn't that way, no one will survive. We're going to see when we get to the bowl judgments, it's intensified. It won't just come upon parts of the earth. It's going to be coming on all of the earth. Let's look at the fourth trumpet. Turn to verse number 12 in chapter 8. We're really clipping along. Have you noticed that? And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars. So as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. Now this is really interesting, and I'll tell you why. This is one of those sentences that you have to read over and over again to try to decipher what it means. And after you've read it over and over again, you really can't. So like I told you last Sunday, what do? You go back to the original language and you translate it and you look at the syntax, and then it makes a lot more sense. Well, I'm not going to go back to the original language to you. I'm just going to tell you I've done that. I've translated this verse. I've looked at the syntax. Let me show you what it means. This fourth trumpet replicates the 9th Egyptian plague. If you remember that plague, Moses stretched out his hand and God sent darkness over Egypt for 3 days. And it was so dark, the Egyptians couldn't see each other and they couldn't move. Now, I'm not saying that they didn't move around in their house. What I'm saying is it was so dark that they couldn't go out. All they could do is kind of feel yourselves. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, but in this church, I'm here to tell you, if you turn off the lights in certain areas and the emergency lights aren't on, it's pitch black. And all you can do is try and feel your way as you're looking. And that's what happened when God sent the darkness upon Egypt for 3 days. Now, when this fourth trumpet sounds, God strikes the heavenly bodies. He strikes the heavenly bodies. You know what I mean by heavenly bodies? The stars, the sun, the moon. He strikes the heavenly bodies with the plague. You see, the word smitten is translated from the Greek word eplege. And eplege is the verb cognate of plague, which means plague. In fact, let me show you how the word plague is used, if you don't mind. Look at Revelation chapter 9, verse number 18. This is how this Greek word is used. A third of mankind was killed by these three plagues. The word plagues is the Greek word plague. So what this is telling us is that God strikes the heavenly bodies with a plague. This plague causes a third of the sun to either burn out or to become what scientists call sunspots. So only 2/3 of the sun is actually producing light. A third of it isn't. It isn't producing light, or it appears to be dark, not doing that. Now, I don't know what causes this to happen. I don't know if it is a sunspot. I don't know if a third of it actually burns out. All I know is that when God strikes these heavenly bodies, it says that a third of the sun stops producing light. And it's not just the sun. A third of the moon is affected. It's like a third of it stops reflecting the sun. And just like the sun, a third of every star either burns out or becomes a sunspot or does whatever's going to happen so that a third of each star stops producing light. But the bottom line is this. When God strikes the heavenly bodies, a third of every heavenly body quits giving light. And it affects the earth's daylight. John says in this verse that as a result of this, a third of the day was darkened and a third of the night. Now, the word darkened in verse number 12 is very interesting. It's translated from the Greek word skatizo, and it means deprived of light, pitch black. In other words, a third of the day, a third of the time when it's supposed to be light because the sun is out, will actually be in total darkness. And a third of the night, even though we expect it to be dark at night, we still see the stars in the sky, we still see the moon. A third of the time at night is going to be total darkness. It's going to be pitch black. Now, I don't know, well, let me go a little bit further. Let me try and explain what I mean by this so you get the idea. Let's suppose about November, and I think this is about when it happens, the sun comes up at 6 o'clock and the sun goes down at 6 o'clock. That sound about right? Does that happen in November? December. Okay, at December. So in December, the sun comes up at 6 a.m. and the sun sets at 6. He says no. It's September. That's what I thought. No, I'm just teasing. So in September, I'm just using this as an example. It could be any month and however it is. But the sun comes up at 6 a.m. and it goes down at 6 p.m. That means you have 12 hours of daylight. According to this verse, what John says is that when God strikes the heavenly bodies, a third of those heavenly bodies will stop producing light. But here's how it's going to affect the earth. In those 12 hours of daylight, a third of that time will be pitch black. The sun's up, but it's dark. And at night, when you have this darkness, but the moon's reflecting the sun, and you see these stars, when you have 12 hours of darkness, but these other things are, a third of it is going to be pitch black. Now, how is this going to be accomplished? I don't know. But in the past, and remember, one of the reasons God did these things in the past is because they point to the future. In fact, as you begin to read the Old Testament prophets, here's what's interesting. The Old Testament prophets, they see the Egyptian plagues as, in a sense, types of what's going to happen on the great day of the Lord. Did you know that? So one of the reasons God did these things upon Egypt, it was not only because it came against their gods and accomplished the three purposes I told you, but it's also to show us that what happened then is only a taste of what's going to happen in the future. But I don't know how this is going to happen, but in the past, God was able to make it totally dark for the Egyptians, but here's the interesting thing. But the Israelites had light. Now remember, the Israelites were in Egypt. Where were the Israelites? They were in a place called the land of Goshen. Now, let me explain how Egypt was laid out in that day, still is in this day, but what happened is, in southern Egypt, The Nile's coming down, and as it gets towards the Mediterranean Sea, it branches out into 7 branches, or it used to branch out into 7 branches. You know, it makes a little bit more now, but what would happen is it would flood. And as it flooded the Nile with 7 branches, all of that silt came in, and that's why Egypt was called, or Egypt meant black dirt. It was wonderful farmland. It was a wonderful place to produce, but only in the place where the Nile was. Does that make sense? So what happened was, the place that you wanted your slaves to be is in the land of Goshen, because that's where the work is. And all the ones who weren't slaves, they lived in southern Egypt, in Memphis and Luxor and all of those different places. That was the place to be, and they would ship all of that stuff back to them. Now, here's what's interesting. God's able to make it totally dark for the Egyptians, but the Israelites have light. That would be like it's totally dark in Tahlequah, but Tulsa has light. Look at Exodus chapter 10, verses 21 through 23. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Lift your hand toward heaven, and the land of Egypt will be covered with the darkness so thick you can feel it." It's like a blanket. Ever been in a place that is so dark you can't see your hand in front of your face, and it feels like a blanket? That's what he says. It's going to be so dark you can feel the darkness. So Moses lifted his hand to the sky, and a deep darkness covered the entire land of Egypt. For how long? 3 days. Don't think this was an eclipse. Do you think it was an eclipse? No, not for 3 days. During all that time, the people could not see each other, and no one moved. That doesn't mean that they just stood frozen. It meant you can't see. So you're wandering around your house doing this. But there was light. Notice what else it says. But there was light, as usual, where the people of Israel lived. It's as if God turned out the lights in heaven for Egypt, but he purposely kept it on for Israel. And that's what's going to happen when the 4th trumpet blows. Except it's going to affect all of the earth. Now, how long is this going to last? Does anyone know? No, you don't know. It doesn't say how long it lasts. Some theologians think it's going to last for the rest of the tribulation. Some believe it's going to last for just a brief period of days, possibly 3, just like the Egyptian plagues. But for however long it lasts, it's going to be scary because it isn't natural. This isn't right. The sun comes up, but a third of it's not. And the way that it's going, for a third of the day, we don't have light, and it's supposed to be daytime. And at night, it's like pitch black, and nothing is shining out there. And there's no logical explanation for it, just like there's no logical explanation for what happened with the 9th Egyptian plague. But here's what's interesting. This is what might explain what Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 24, verses 21 through 22. How many of you remember the Olivet Discourse? Jesus is telling, go ahead and leave this up. I don't want you to take it off. Jesus was talking to his disciples, and he was telling them, when you see the abomination of desolation take place, and when's that going to happen? In the middle of the tribulation. When you see that take place, you flee. And then he goes further and says there's going to be great tribulation. Now, let me read, if you don't mind, verses 21 and 22. Notice what it says. Don't have my reading glasses, so I'm going to have to look real careful. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. Now here's what's interesting. How long will the tribulation last? 7 years. Is that going to be shortened? No. It will last 7 years. It's going to happen just the way God said it's going to happen. Then Jesus comes along, he's talking, he says, except the days be shortened, boy, no one's going to live. Could this be what he's talking about when he says the days will be shortened? What he means is people aren't going to be out and about. Instead of having 12 hours of daylight, you're only going to have 8. Because we're going to find out as we get going a little bit further, we're going to get into where it really gets tough. We're going to see a dense darkness that comes up. We're going to find out that it's going to get so hot The sun's going to be unbelievable. But Jesus says those days are going to be shortened. Now, me personally, I believe that when this plague hits and everyone's scared to death, what they don't realize is, in the midst of the plague, this is also the mercy of God. Because if he didn't shorten the days, even the elect wouldn't make it through. Now, the elect he's talking about is not the church. Who is it? The Jews, the 144,000. Those who received Jesus Christ. Those who missed the rapture but accepted Jesus Christ after the rapture.